welcome to the Heartland Institute's 24th Anniversary Benefit Dinner. Please welcome the following members of the Board of Directors of the Heartland Institute. The founder of the Heartland Institute, Chairman Emeritus of the Board of Directors, Dave Padden. From Illinois, Chicago, the President of the Planned Realty Group, Robert Buford. From Chicago, the head of the real estate department at McGuire Woods, Paul Fisher. From Inverness, Illinois, the managing director of Banknote Capital Corporation, Jim Fitzgerald. From Winnetka, Illinois, attorney Dan Hill. From Wilmette, Illinois, a founding member of the Board of Directors, economist Jim Justin. From Oak Brook Terrace, Illinois, portfolio manager and analyst for the Iron Bridge Capital Management, Jeff Madden. From Chicago, the managing partner, principal at Cognitive Capital, Art Margulis. From Chicago, the retired vice chairman and chief financial officer of Medline Inc., Frank Resnick. From San Diego, California, attorney and rising film producer, Elizabeth Rose. And chairman of the Board of Directors of the Heartland Institute, Professor Herb Wahlberg. And now, your host for this evening, born in a small town, the original Iron Man, the president of the Heartland Institute, Joseph Bass.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to see you all here. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I have to say, as I say just about every year, this room is just spectacular. It's one of the most remarkable public spaces, I think, in the city of Chicago. 24 years ago, a group of small business people in Chicago decided to start a free market think tank, and they hired me as the first employee. I lived in Hyde Park at the time, and I would take the train up to 12th Street, and then I would walk up Michigan Avenue to our office on Monroe Street. And I would walk past this hotel every morning, and I'd walk past it every night. And within a month or two of the Heartland Institute being started, I snuck into this room, and I stood here and said, holy smokes, what a fantastic room. Someday the Heartland Institute is going to fill this room. And we filled this room tonight. There are 509 people on the registration list, so there's probably about 509 people here with us tonight. So thank you all very much. Those of you who haven't been at a Heartland Benefit before, you should know that there will be no formal prayer before dinner, so go ahead and eat that salad. There will be no Pledge of Allegiance. We don't sing the national anthem. There's no head table, so you're not going to be able to watch us eat. Okay. All the celebrities in the room, and there are scores and scores of celebrities. There's about 40 elected officials in the room. There's heads of think tanks and very prominent business people. They are at your table. So the best conversation is going to be with the person sitting next to you. So I hope you make a point of getting to know the person that you're sitting with. Except for the person sitting next to Dave Padden. Where's Dave Padden? And there will be 2 keynote speakers instead of 1. Most events like this have a big keynote speaker. We usually have 2. And this is the third year that we're going to do a debate over an important public policy issue rather than have just stand-up speakers. Our debaters tonight are Peter Brimelow and Jacob Hornberger. They're going to be debating what immigration policy should a free society adopt. With all of the concern about the financial crisis going on right now, it's hard to remember, but this was a really big issue 3 or 4 months ago when we picked it as the debate topic. Some of the biggest protests in the country since the civil rights era have taken place on the immigration issue. We've got two outstanding speakers, one just as committed to open borders as the other one is to expressing reservations about current immigration policy. I think it's going to be a very lively debate, and I hope that you all participate in that debate. First, by writing questions on the cards that are on the table. There should be a stack of index cards, or maybe there will be a stack of index cards, so just put your question on that card, and Heartland staff will pick it up and bring it up to the front after the debate. And you can also participate by congratulating good speakers and criticizing bad speakers, especially if you're sitting at the back of the room. So don't feel like you have to sit in stony silence during the debate. Tonight's event is a fundraiser for the Heartland Institute, so I'd like to thank the Platinum and Gold table sponsors. They are Altria Group, Inc., Assurant Health, Banknote Capital, David Padden, Herb Wahlberg, Jeff Madden, Mike Kaiser and Philip Friedman, Paul and Christine Fisher, Robert Buford, Susan and Frank Resnick, Tina and Jim Johnston, the United Republican Fund, and UST Public Affairs Incorporated. Please give a round of applause for our Platinum and Gold sponsors. This year, for the 5th time, we held a day-long policy seminar in advance of this event. And we had about 100 people over at the University Club, and we had a whole series of speakers. That's where many of the legislators were attending to get some new information on public policy issues. I'd like to thank the sponsors who made that event possible. They're Altria Group, Assurant Health, Denson Hall Resources, Secure Services Corporation, Microsoft Corporation, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers Association, and UST Public Affairs. I'd like a round of applause, please, for the sponsors of that event. Each year at these events, we pause for a moment and recognize the freedom fighters who have passed away since the last time we held an event. These are men and women who have devoted their lives and their fortune and their honor to defending freedom. It's not a popular cause, and so we'd like to recognize the following people. Unfortunately, it's a pretty long list. A lot of really interesting people passed away over the last 12 months. Bernie Baltic, who was a longtime supporter of the Heartland Institute and a member of our board of directors. William F. Buckley, Jr., founder of National Review and, of course, the author of many books and columns. Charlton Heston, the chairman of the National Rifle Association, better known to some of us as Moses, and Ben-Hur. And my favorite, Colonel George Taylor from Planet of the Apes. Remember that? Anne McCracken passed away. Anne McCracken was one of the very first libertarians and objectivists that I ever met here in Illinois. Vince Miller, he was the president of the International Society for Individual Liberty. Victor Molione, longtime president of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Frank O'Connell, the former executive director of the John M. Olin Foundation. Pat Rooney, the former chairman of Golden Rule Insurance, one of the inventors of health savings accounts and the whole revolution of consumer-driven healthcare. Dan Searle, chairman of G.D. Searle and Company here in Illinois and a benefactor for many free market organizations. Tony Snow passed away. Remember Tony Snow? He was a news anchor, syndicated columnist, and press secretary for President George W. Bush. Kent Snyder passed away. He was the campaign chairman for Ron Paul's presidential campaign. Sir John Templeton, an extraordinary investor, founder of the Templeton Foundation and the Templeton Prize, passed away. And finally, Connie Williams, the wife for 48 years of economist Walter Williams, passed away in December of last year. These were truly outstanding people. Many of them contributed to the Heartland Institute, either with their ideas or their money or their moral support. I hope we can have maybe a round of applause for the fallen freedom fighters. All right, it's also a tradition at these events that I spend just a couple of minutes complaining about how freedom got defeated over the last year or celebrating some victories that we had. I'm going to just mention two things. The first, of course, is the financial crisis over the last month. That's been just preoccupying everybody. I think I speak for a lot of people in this room. I have deep concerns about the security of my own investments and my lifetime savings and my job. I don't know if we're heading into a serious recession or a Great Depression. There's a lot of very smart people who think that that's lying ahead. But what I do know is pretty simple. Government overregulation of housing and banking, overspending, manipulation of the money supply, corruption, and incompetence were the causes of this crisis. I think it follows that expecting the government to solve this crisis is the very definition of insanity. I think the bailout that's being negotiated right now as we sit here, being discussed and voted on tomorrow in the House of Representatives, is likely to make things worse and not better. And finally, I think if we allow the politicians and the media and the liberal academics to persuade the American people that this crisis was due to too little government instead of too much government, we will have made a tremendous mistake, and we will have lost one of the most important battles for individual freedom in our lifetime. I'll mention just one other public policy issue. As many of you know, we've been devoting a lot of our time to fighting global warming extremism. Paul Johnson, one of the great historians of our time, author of many, many books, just a couple of days ago wrote something about global warming. He wrote, "Marxism, Freudianism, global warming. These are proof of which history offers so many examples that people can be suckers on a grand scale. To their fanatical followers, they are a substitute for religion. Global warming in particular," this is Paul Johnson writing this, "global warming in particular is a creed, a faith, a dogma that has little to do with science. If people are in genuine need of religion, why don't they just turn to the original article?" Amen, I would say to that. So the Heartland Institute has been doing a lot on this issue over the last several years. So far, we have distributed over 1 million books and policy studies trying to put out a sound science, sound economics approach to global warming. We've distributed over 1 million videos. We've appeared in print on this single topic over 1,000 times. We've appeared millions of times online. In liberal and environmental circles, our name is dirt, but we're winning this debate. Yeah. Judge us by our enemies and our critics, I would say. But we're winning this debate, and it's a remarkable success story for the power of ideas and the power of truth. In March, we hosted a conference in New York City. We had 550 skeptics in that room. These are scientists and economists and professional policy analysts. They came from 22 countries from all around the world. They spent 2.5 days talking about the real science and the real economics of climate change. It generated press attention around the world. In fact, tonight, if you were in Britain, you could watch us on TV. There's a British program on BBC that has excerpts of footage from the conference that we held in New York City. And people are paying attention to all of this press attention. Gallup poll does polls 2 or 3 times a year asking people, do you think global warming is a problem? And do you think that we are responsible for global warming? In 2008, the percentage of people who answered yes to those questions was less than it was in 2007. It's now drifting around 45%, and it's dropping every time they take that poll. I think we've won the debate. The American public don't believe it's a crisis. So this is an important issue because what's at stake is trillions of dollars, literally trillions of dollars in taxes, excessive regulation on industry. This is a last-ditch attempt by the left, I think, to destroy the foundations of capitalism. If we let them get away with this, we're going to regret it. So we don't regret a minute or a dollar that we've spent trying to fight these guys. We have with us tonight two real heroes in the battle against global warming alarmism, and I'd like them to stand up briefly and just get recognized. They're Dr. S. Fred Singer and Dennis Avery. There they are. These guys are heroes. They're absolutely amazing people. I'm going to say a few more words about them when we make the award ceremony right at the end of this event. But they're personal heroes of mine. They've taught me an enormous amount. And it's just been an honor to work with these guys. I have just a couple of housekeeping things I have to tell you before I turn this over to Tim Slagle. This year marks the end of another long Heartland tradition, and that is giving away free cigars at the end of the event. Yeah, it was great while it lasted, and we appreciate the companies that donated cigars to us in the past. As you know, in Chicago, it's now against the law to smoke in an indoor space like this. Last year, we gave you cigars and said you couldn't smoke in this room. And being libertarians, some of you smoked anyway, and we kind of got in trouble with the hotel staff. So we can't do that again. However, we can do something that's still legal. At the end of the night, if you enjoy nicotine, like some of us do, I brought with me some smokeless tobacco products, Skoal, up here. I've got all kinds of it back here, too. So if you'd like to come up here and chew for a little while, you're welcome to do that. If you're under the age of 21, you've got 3.5 hours to find a phony ID, okay? And I'm not going to check it real closely. For those of you who are health nuts and non-smokers or anti-smokers or former smokers, we're also going to be holding a drawing for a basket that contains wine, cheese, crackers, and chocolate, which is alcohol, fat, carbohydrates, and carcinogens. Okay? That's going to take place at 9 o'clock. That basket is sitting on a table, I was told, at the back of the room, and there's a... Oh, there we go. Yep, in that corner of the room. And there's a bowl where you can put your business card or put your name and address on a slip of paper and put it in there. You got to do that before 9 o'clock, 9-ish, so that the bowl can be brought up here and I'll draw and give you your basket of poison. All right. As most of you know, there's a debate taking place tonight between two of the vice presidential candidates for president. It starts at 8 o'clock. We are recording that debate, and starting at 9 o'clock, when our program ends, we're going to broadcast it up on that big screen right there. And there's going to be free dessert and an open bar. So if you want to watch the debate with friends and get drunk and eat lots of stuff and chew tobacco, this is where you want to be. So stay here with us if you could. And finally, Tim Slagle is with us tonight. Tim is too modest to say it, but he is the funniest libertarian comedian in the world today. He is absolutely hilarious. Those of you who attended last year and the year before will remember his performances. He performs from coast to coast. He performs in Europe. He's a good friend of mine. He's a great friend of the Heartland Institute. He's agreed to perform over the noise of your dinner. So dinner is going to be served. I hope that you'll pay attention to him. He'll perform for about 15 minutes. Please welcome Tim Slagle.
Keep it going for Joe Bass, ladies and gentlemen. Let him hear it. Amazing what he can do with a couple $1 million, isn't it? Imagine how many Heartlands could be built for just the cost of one government bailout. I don't know if this comes off or not. Let me see. Yeah, it does. Cool. I've always enjoyed my times here at the Heartland. I love the smoking and the drinking, but, you know, the smoking's gone. You know, if you want to smoke after dinner, you're going to have to step out to North Dakota. Yeah, some people have their way, boy. The only place you're going to be able to light up is in front of a firing squad. But the drinking's okay. You can still drink as long as it's not between the 7th and 9th inning. And believe me, last night between the 7th and the 9th inning is when you wanted to drink. Myself, I love to drink. My philosophy has always been a hangover is just your body's way of telling you you shouldn't have stopped drinking. You laugh, but I'm serious. I got in this business 25 years ago after flunking out of college and finding myself unable to hold down a day job. And what I decided is I got to find a job where I can sleep till noon every day, work an hour or less, say whatever I want, hang out at parties, and drink for free. Lo and behold, 25 years later, that is exactly what I'm doing. Isn't it nice to know we live in a country where you can achieve anything you aspire to? I love America, man. Land of the free, home of the brave, nation to the fattest people on earth. It's true, in the rest of the world I would be obese. In America, I just look like I'm from Wisconsin. We grow them fat in the US of A, let me tell you. We have people so fat that they throw away food. I'm walking through the park the other day. I'm actually watching a homeless man feeding stale bread crust to the birds. Just a little too stale for his liking. And it suddenly occurs to me that there's really no one starving in this country. And I know there's people hungry, and I know there's people eating stuff they'd rather not eat, but there's no one starving, not to death. Last people I remember reading about starving to death in America were Lindsay Lohan and Mary-Kate Olsen. If there were really people starving to death, you wouldn't have seen that man feeding bread to the birds. You wouldn't have seen birds. In Cuba right now, there's no such thing as a stray animal. I doubt there's many pets left. They can't even keep Cubans in Cuba. It's true, you know, if you live in Cuba, you're not allowed to spend more than an hour on a beach at a time. Because if you leave a Cuban standing on that beach for more than an hour, he starts going, I can make that. Just need something that floats. Juanita, hand me that beer case right there. Get your mother, we're going to America. They can't believe our wealth here. In Cuba, they go, you mean in America? You have boulevards and parks just full of pigeons? And nobody even wants them there? And like they're so tame, they'll eat right out of your hand? Even if you got a big stick in the other? Poultry every night in America. Look at me like I'm exaggerating. I don't know if you saw this. About 3 years ago, 12 Cubans tried to get to America in a '59 Buick. And they almost made it. About 3 miles offshore when the Coast Guard found them, you know, pretty obvious. You know, middle of the ocean, 12 Cubans in a Buick. You had to have been an Oldsmobile. I'm implying that they prefer the Oldsmobile. Not that Oldsmobiles float. Yeah, I want to point that out. Oldsmobiles do not float. Senator Kennedy pointed that out to me. Yeah, am I going too far now? I'm sorry. Well, yeah, I don't know. You see, the topic is immigration, and I can't really talk about immigrants. I have a rule: you don't make fun of people who are handling your food. Okay, now I know I'm going too far. I don't mind. I came here with an immigrant. I came here with Jerry Agar from Canada over here, WLS, if you listen to that. He's from a country where they don't have to build a wall. You know, he's hoping that global warming gets so bad that maybe someday they will have to keep Americans out. But, you know, myself, I'm looking forward to global warming. It was cold here last winter. Oh man, it was so cold, I saw Governor Blagojevich stuck to a campaign promise. That is some cold weather. I don't know if I even believe it. I know they're trying to tell us like the ocean's going to rise 23 feet. They're trying to scare us. IPCC even says that the ocean, worst case scenario, is only 23 inches over the next 100 years. Oh, okay, here's a little example here, okay? Pretend I'm in the ocean, okay? Here's 23 inches of ocean rise, right? About, ooh, that looks like a crisis. Okay, watch carefully. Here's how you deal with 23 inches of ocean rise. Now, if you can't move that far in 100 years, you deserve to die. That's not a crisis, that's Darwin. And it astounds me that the same people who are worried about 23 inches think you can spend $700 billion on a wild weekend spree. People are weird about numbers. Big numbers sound, you see anything, it sounds like a big number. I watched a televangelist. He actually said that the odds of the scripture being a coincidence versus a prophecy were 100 million billion to 1. Oh, okay, here's a little hint for all you up-and-coming televangelists. If you're going to try to convince me of something, use a real number. 100 million billion is not a real number. 100 million billion is the amount of money a fifth grader bets another fifth grader to jump off the roof. It's like $11 zillion. 700 billion, that's a huge number. You know, not to John McCain or Barack Obama, apparently. Of course, Barack Obama, he raised $52 million last month. That's almost $1 million per state. I'm just going to wait for y'all to catch up on that one, because I think that's funny. He made fun of John McCain because John McCain didn't know the difference between Shia and Sunni. Well, at least John McCain knows there's only 50 states. And when John McCain was Barack's age, there were only 38. John McCain, he says that he's going to be pro-life, you know, for the rights of the unborn. You know, which makes sense because when he first ran for office, none of his constituents were born yet. Barack doesn't seem to care about global warming, man. He'll fly to any city just to make a statement. He flew to Springfield to announce his candidacy. He flew to Unity, New Hampshire just to shake hands with Hillary. He flew to Independence, Missouri to talk about patriotism. You know, Michelle's just waiting for this to get over with so she can take him to Intercourse, Pennsylvania. You think he's the candidate of the people. You have to say that. He's for hope, he's for change, and who can disagree with that? Why, when I went to the gas station just the other day with $100, I found myself saying, I hope there's change. He wants to be one of the people. I mean, did you see him dancing on Ellen DeGeneres? It's amazing. Not only is he breaking barriers, he's ruining stereotypes. Okay, enough of the politics. Let's talk about religion. The Pope says that he's concerned about global warming. I don't know how much credibility I put in the Pope. The Pope doesn't want Catholics using birth control. If you're Catholic, you're supposed to use something called the rhythm method. And for those of you who are not parents, The rhythm method means that you can have sex at certain times of the month. And if something happens, that's just the will of God. The will of God is what the Pope says. Now, meanwhile, he's traveling around the world with 1,200 bodyguards inside of a bulletproof plexiglass Pope-mobile. Well, not much faith in the will of God here. Oh, he's entitled to his Pope phylactics. And I don't know if I really believe the environmentalists. They're saying that 1/3 of all species are going extinct. I don't know if that's true. Just in Northern California, they photographed a species of wolverine that they thought was extinct. They were amazed to see something so rare. In fact, that was the most amazing find since they found a Republican in Chicago. And right now they're going to use that camera in Illinois. They're going to see if they can actually photograph a bear anywhere near a goalpost. Boy, if I keep going like this, Joe, you're going to have to announce my name at the beginning of next year's show. So what else? Al Gore. Speaking of global warming. Al Gore actually flew to Bali last year to tell people that they're flying too much. But not like he cares about his carbon footprint. When was the last time you think he actually saw his feet? He made like $100 million last year. That's amazing. I've come to realize that there's not much difference between wealthy Democrats and wealthy Republicans, except that wealthy Democrats make sure the maid sorts the trash into the proper recycling bin. And both of them don't seem to care about taxes. Folks, we have to teach the next generation about taxes. I've done this before, but I can't stress it enough. If you've got kids, please teach them. And the best time you can do this is right around the corner, Halloween. You see, because they're going to put in about 8 full hours of power trick-or-treating. They're going to be bringing home a nice big bag of what should be take-home candy. Just greet that little tyke at the door. Hey, that's a nice big bag of candy you got there, Harry Potter. But first of all, now see, just because you made this much, well, we have to take away this much income tax. Then, to ensure you'll have candy in your old age, we pay the Social Security tax. Quit crying! You're going to see it in 50, 60 years. Okay, I tell you what, we just put that right up here. Won't touch it till then. Okay, you know what, man? I got to level with you. Grandpa's going to eat all that. You'll have grandchildren of your own, don't you worry. Ooh, last of all, we can't forget that state tax, can we? Oh, wait a minute. We're in Illinois, aren't we? Here's your Snickers bar. Oh, wait, here, this is funnier. Hold on just a minute. Payday. Oh, whoa, you're going to eat that right now? Hold it. Sales tax. Oh, wait, we're in Cook County. You know, I think kids are smarter than that. I bet if you did that to your kid, he wouldn't even get dressed up the next year. Probably going to spend the whole evening on the couch in front of the tube, and when Mom puts out that big bowl of candy for the other kids, he's just going to walk over to that bowl, dump it in his bag. I'm on welfare this year. Hey, listen, you've all been great for listening to me. Thank you very much. Enjoy your dinner. See you next year, maybe.
Sun-Times and Crane Chicago Business, now Executive Vice President of the Heartland Institute, Dan Miller.
The disembodied voice you hear is Ralph Connor, who is our local legislative manager at the Heartland Institute. Thank you very much, Ralph. Thank you. Good evening and welcome. Immigration is one of those intensely contentious issues that has divided libertarians, free marketeers, conservatives, and Republicans. If there's a solution to the problem of illegal immigration and its attendant costs that would somehow be acceptable to all of us, I haven't seen it. But tonight we have two men who are knowledgeable on the immigration issue, as knowledgeable on that issue as they are articulate. And in their debate, perhaps we can begin to settle in our own minds what kind of position to take. Jacob Hornberger is founder and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. He received his BA in economics from Virginia Military Institute and his law degree from the University of Texas. He's a regular writer for the Freedom Foundation's publication, Freedom Daily, and co-editor or author or contributor to the foundation's 8 books. Jacob has also advanced freedom and free markets on talk radio and in daily newspapers and periodicals throughout the United States and around the world. You'll hear him referred to by his nickname, Bumper. He says he received that name in the crib when he was careening around the sides of his crib, bouncing from one bumper to the bumper pad to another one. Even then, Bumper Hornberger was eager for the debate to begin. Our second debater is Peter Brimelow, a senior fellow with the Pacific Research, well, you can see where this is going, all right. A senior fellow with the Pacific Research Institute and a columnist for CBS Market Watch. A financial journalist, Peter has written extensively about the economics of education, immigration, and a wide range of other topics, and published widely in every major publication in the United States. Peter is the author of several books, including the landmark Alien Nation, Common Sense About America's Immigration Disaster, which has become one of the intellectual pillars of the anti-immigration movement. Peter brings an unusual perspective to the debate. As you'll notice when you hear him, he's an immigrant himself, born in England, but graduated from Stanford University in California. He emigrated to Canada and worked as a financial journalist there for years before returning to the United States. Here's how the debate's going to work. Peter Brimelow will open for 12 minutes, and Bumper Hornberger will follow with 12 himself. Peter and Bumper will rebut for 8 minutes each, and finally they will wrap up with 4 minutes each, with Bumper having the closing remarks. They'll take questions for a half an hour afterwards. You'll find note cards at your table, and I ask you to write your questions. Heartland staffers will be circulating through the room, picking them up and bring them up to me at the podium. So with that, let the debate begin with the president of the Center for American Unity, Peter Brimelow.
Thank you, Dan. Ladies and gentlemen, the big problem with immigrants, as you all know, is that when they get excited, they talk quickly and nobody can understand them. So if you don't understand me tonight, please throw a bun or raise a fiery cross or some other cultural symbol, and I will redouble my efforts to assimilate acoustically. It is odd that I'm an immigrant talking about immigration, but hey, the Wall Street Journal is always telling us that immigrants do the dirty work Americans won't do, and here I am. The great thing about the immigration issue is that it's not like abortion or something where everybody knows everybody thinks. You get to argue with friends. Nobody knows. You never know who's going to come down on which side of the issue. For example, Bumper Hornberger and I agree, I'm sure, on 99% of issues we ever have to think about. I was confident coming in here tonight that there were 2 people in this audience who opposed the bailout, in this group who opposed the bailout, and I'm one and I'm debating the other. But I guess Joe Baxter posed it too, or maybe I misunderstood. One of the reasons why we're not used to the way the argument breaks down is because it is fundamentally a new issue, immigration. Americans think that immigration is a continuous thing, and they're told, that we're a nation of immigrants. Well, of course, all nations are nations of immigrants. There's no known case where people grew out of the ground. What's unusual about the US is at the speed with which it was put together. The problem is it can be unput together just as quickly. But because this issue is new, and it really stems from 1965 when the government decided to open the floodgates again after a 40-year period when there was almost no immigration, the Immigration Act of 1965, and simultaneously decided in a mysterious way to stop enforcing the law on the southern borders. Because it's new, there's a whole generation of pundits and politicians who simply haven't reckoned with it. It's typically the case in academic life and intellectual life that it's not the case that one school convinces another. What happens is that the old school dies off. It croaks and it's succeeded by a newer school. Most people don't have new ideas after they turn 18. And that's really what we need to have happen here. We need to see a new generation of people come along who were born when immigration was a problem. They didn't grow up to maturity when immigration was not a problem. I mentioned the pause that we get between the great pause in the middle of the last century, where there was 40-odd years there was almost no immigration at all. That pause is very typical of US immigration history. It's not continuous. There have been many pauses in American immigration history, stretching right back to the colonial period. And those pauses have allowed assimilation to take place. The problem right now is that we have a new great wave of immigration, and it will have to be cut off, just as the last great wave of immigration was cut off in the 1920s. It's not going to resolve itself any other way. Now, I want to make 3 points in my remaining time. The first point you've got to realize about immigration is that what we're talking about is a government policy. Government determines the numbers of people coming in, the skill levels of the people coming in, and where they're coming in from, what type of people they are. You frequently find that libertarians discuss immigration as if it's like the rain or something that naturally happens. It's not, and it doesn't naturally happen. The government has to decide to open the spigot or close the spigot. The second point to realize about immigration is that it's a very, very big deal. If it wasn't for immigration, post-65 immigration, the American population would have stabilized because all races are bringing their family sizes down to replacement level. It would have stabilized below 300 million. But actually, it's going to be driven up to well over 400 million by 2050 or so. And of those 400 million, more than half will be minorities. This is a country that was 90% white in 1965. Essentially, the government, this is a social engineering experiment and a transformation without precedent in the history of the world. Basically, the American government, around about 1965, apparently decided to do what Bertolt Brecht recommended that the East German communists do after the risings in 1954. He wrote a poem and he said, the government should dissolve the people and elect a new one. That's what's happening here. The American government has decided to elect a new people. Quite on open, generally it's very difficult in this country to discuss things about racial balance. The Census Bureau just finally admitted that at sometime about 2042 or 3, whites were going to a minority in this country. They tried very hard to avoid facing it for a long time. And people will often say to you, why are you mentioning this uncomfortable subject? I mention it because it's a fact. I like facts. But my attitude is, it's not up to me to say why this is a problem. It's up to people who are in favor of this to explain why it's okay. Why do they want to transform America, the America that existed in 1965 when the government opened the floodgates? What is the purpose of it? You have to show a positive reason for it. Now, the third point I want to make about this inflow is that it brings no economic benefit whatever, in aggregate, to native-born Americans. And this has actually been the consensus among labor economists for more than 15 years, since before I was researching Alienation, the book out of which my webzine, vdare.com, ultimately flowed. The basic work that you should look at if you're interested is the National Research Council's report, The New Americans, which was published in 1997. It showed that there was no benefit in aggregate to this inflow, to the native-born Americans. It's not increasing their wealth. It does increase GDP, but the great bulk of that is captured by the immigrants themselves in the form of their wages. And it has a tremendous and dramatic redistribution effect within the incomes of the wealth and so on of the native-born. Basically, it shifts about 2% of GDP from labour to capital. It's one of the major reasons why we see wages stagnating over the last 30 years, over the great swathes of American life. Most Americans have seen their wages stagnate in real terms over the last 30 years. And it's to a considerable extent because of competition from immigrants. And it explains also why this debate is so difficult to get off the ground. Immigration does benefit, wealthy people in this country. It benefits the country club, people who go to country clubs. It solves the servant problem. But for most Americans, it's a real problem. They just happen to be voiceless. If you think about it, it's not surprising that the immigration doesn't benefit the native-born a great deal, or indeed at all. Because it's obviously not necessary to an economy of this size and complexity and depth of capital. The Japanese have been growing very happily, become the second largest economy in the world without any immigration at all. Who waits on their tables? Who cleans up their hotel rooms? They seem to get by. As a matter of fact, in large parts of this country, people get by without even now, without immigrants to wait on the tables. They do it themselves. One of the reasons for why immigration has not benefited as much as it should have done is because of the welfare state. At the time of the last Great Wave, there was no welfare state on the scale that we see now. It caused all kinds of peculiar redistribution effects within the economy. That's why Milton Friedman said, the great economist Milton Friedman, whose name I saw up here a few minutes ago, said shortly before he died, it's just obvious that you can't have free immigration and a welfare state. They're just incompatible. As a matter of fact, I would say the current crisis that we have is to a considerable extent an example of this. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were in the business of shoveling money out to minorities for political reasons, very largely immigrants, and often illegal immigrants. They were under tremendous political pressure to do it. Now, of course, the mortgage industry was happy to do this kind of thing because it liked making risky loans because it made money on it. But there's no doubt that it was, in the short run, but there's no doubt that it was forced to do it by political pressure. So to a considerable extent, what we're looking at right now is a minority mortgage meltdown and a diversity recession. Let me one final point about immigration, a conclusion. The question is, what is the appropriate policy for a free society? Immigration policy for a free society. Free society is not an abstraction. It grows out of a particular culture and a particular set of institutions in America. It's not something that can be created de novo. Economists have the concept of a meta-market, the framework of institutions and laws and so on that are necessary for a functioning free market. One of them, for example, is property rights. A certain degree of social coherence and unity, not diversity, is necessary for a functioning free market. One of the things that immigration has done in this country is enormously strengthened the hand of the state in its various sort of neo-socialist interventionist actions. It's quite obvious right now that John McCain could win this election if he ran against affirmative action. And a very brave black conservative, Ward Connolly, has got those issues on the ballot in several places. But McCain is running away from this issue, and apparently the reason is he's afraid he will alienate Hispanics. Hispanics who were never discriminated against in this country, 40% of whom were actually immigrants, and yet they're eligible for affirmative action. And the leader of the party of the right in this country is afraid to take the issue on. That's one example of the chilling effect of immigration on public policy. Another aspect, of course, is that, if you have a lot, for example, of Mexicans come into the country, there's a point at which it becomes Mexico. And large parts of the US have become Mexico. I mean, there's several states, several towns in California, for example, that have serious problems with corruption and so on. Southgate, Parley, there's several examples of this. The federal government has to step in, the state government has to step in. They're behaving like Mexican towns. Why would we expect anything else? So the moral of this story is that immigration is a luxury, not a necessity. There's a point, and right now in the US, it's not necessary at all, and it's necessary to cut it off before it cuts us off and threatens the free society that was 200 years here in the making. Thank you very much.
Jacob Hornberger, Bumper, you have 12 minutes.
Let me first say that it's very, very nice to be here at this annual dinner of the Heartland Institute, and it's more than that for me. It's actually a big honor to be playing a role in this grand event. Heartland has been such a great inspiration to all of us in the freedom movement that it's just really great to be part of this event. And thank you to Joe Bass and the Heartland for having me here. All of us were born and raised in an era of socialism. Now, socialism is not just government taking money from one person and giving it to another person. Socialism involves more than that. It also involves a process known as central planning. This is a process in which government officials plan in a top-down, command and control manner the economic activities of multitudes of people. There's one distinguishing characteristic of central planning: crises. And it would be difficult to find a better example of central planning than immigration. Here's how the process works. A long time ago, central planners in Washington decided that they needed a plan for immigration. A plan, as Peter points out, that allocated a certain number of immigrants that could come in from the countries around the world. They did more than that, as he points out. They decided on the type of immigrant that could come in under this plan. None of this wretched refuse of your teeming shores for these planners. No huddled masses yearning to breathe free for them. They wanted a well-heeled immigrant, higher skilled, better educated, a little bit of money, literate, speak a little English. And so they came up with this plan and they enacted it into law. And all was fine and good, except for one thing. That wretched refuse and those huddled masses didn't give a hoot for this central plan. For they had been accustomed to coming in without a central plan. You see, they essentially took the position that they have a right to sustain their lives through labor, that they have a right to engage in mutually beneficial transactions with other people on a voluntary basis, people who are willing to hire them with their own money, that they wanted to pursue happiness. And they had the audacity to believe that these rights pre-exist to government, that they're inherent in human beings, and that they trump central plans. And they came anyway. And that created a crisis. Because here was an entire group of people that were not conforming to the plan. And thus begins the crisis of interventionism, as Ludwig von Mises put it. They decide they need an immigration service to go down to the crossing points, the entry points, to check people's papers to see if they've gone through all the rigmarole to get permission under the plan, and stood in line and put their photographs on there and put their qualifications and passed the tests. All fine and good, except for one thing. Those huddled masses decided to circumvent those crossing points, and that's when they started trespassing on farms and ranches and going up to the next town, catching the bus and heading north, or in the harbors, or in the airports. And so here comes more interventions to address the crisis. They've got roving border patrols all along the highways along the border. They got fixed checkpoints. They got passport checks for Hispanic Americans that just want to travel within the United States. None of it works. So they pass a felony law, felony conviction for anybody transporting illegal aliens. Now that's it, you see, because if they can't leave the border, end of story. Except for one thing. A huge black market forms in the illegal transportation of illegal aliens. And now there's just a bigger crisis, immigration crisis in America. And so they say, okay, one last intervention. We're going to make it illegal for American businessmen to hire these people, these huddled masses. Whoa! Now what you've got is you've gone from a central plan that has morphed into a direct attack on American free enterprise, American businessmen, who are spending their money in the way they choose by hiring people that they feel work hard, with a felony conviction and a federal time in the penitentiary. But that's the end of the game, because we all know if they can't get jobs, despite what they say about their coming on welfare, they're not going to come. So that was the end of the game. Well, except for one thing. Those huddled masses started getting fake ID cards because they wanted to work. And the American employer looked the other way because he wanted them to work in his business. And he was scared of getting sued anyway for discrimination. And so we go for another intervention, another intervention. Now they want to build this Berlin fence. Why don't they just go ahead and make it a wall? I mean, why stop at a fence? You know, put the barbed wire on top, the broken glass, the trenches, put a soldier every 5 yards, 50 caliber machine guns, M16s. And you know, they said they were going to build it on the border, and that turned out to be not true. They went down there and they started taking people's property in Texas. Eminent domain, not to take the property to give to the rich developers, as they said, as they did in Kilo, but this is to just take the people's property that's been in their family for generations to build the fence. And take my word for it, the interventions will never stop, because this is the crisis of central planning. This is what Mises and Hayek and Friedman were talking about. And with each intervention, you head inevitably in the direction of omnipotent government. Central government, especially when you look at the interventions in the financial field, the banking field, the drug war. You combine them all, that's the end of the road, omnipotent government. Just ask the North Koreans, who have a perfectly sealed border, that's their model, and who also have a totally controlled society. Now, if we remain within this paradigm of central planning, that's what you're going to be in for. Peter's been in this business, been arguing this position for 20-something years. 5 years from now, he'll be back and talk to you about the crisis. There is an alternative paradigm. It is a paradigm that involves the absence of central planning, the absence of interventionism. It is a paradigm based on free markets. That is, markets that are free of government control. That's what free markets and free enterprise once meant. Free of any government control. The spontaneous order. The free flows of people across borders. This shocks Americans. And it's not a surprise that it shocks Americans, this idea. Because we all grew up in this regime of central planning and interventionism. Now, we've been advocating this position for 20 years, almost 20 years at the Future of Freedom Foundation. We have a book entitled The Case for Free Trade and Open Immigration we published in the 90s. In the last year, there have been two of the greatest books you will ever read in this area. One by a conservative, one by a liberal. Jason Riley of the Wall Street Journal editorial board, his book, Let Them In, The Case for Open Borders. A liberal, Philippe Legrand, his book, Immigrants, Your Country Needs Them. What's remarkable about these books is not just that they make the case for immigration is good from an economic sense and a moral sense. They make the case for the unhampered market economy in the area of immigration. Free markets, free flows of people and goods and services. Now, some of you perhaps are thinking, this is impossible. I mean, is this guy for real? I mean, did he just come from another planet? How could you possibly do such a thing? Well, for one thing, we have a heritage of it before the central planning came into existence. But even more important, we have a model right here in the country in which we live. We take it for granted because we were all born and raised under it as well. But do you realize we live in the largest free trade, free movements of people zone in history? People unrestricted crossing state lines every day. Now people can say, but they're Americans. Besides the point, we've got people crossing borders that are not monitored, controlled, directed. Each state does not lose its borders. They don't disappear. The state doesn't lose its sovereignty. You cross over into a state and you comply with the laws of that state. And we all instinctively know that this is economically beneficial. Because in every economic transaction, every trade, both sides benefit. We know this to be true because people give up something they value less in a trade for something they value more. So that standards of living rise not just because of factories and capital production, which are important, but simply through the act of trades. And so when you add up all these multiple trades that nobody's monitoring, controlling, and allocating labor from this state to another state, you've got the highest standard of living in history. That's partly a result of free flows of people across borders. We take it for granted. But it was only thanks to the framers that we have that regime. So we have two paradigms that we're debating tonight, and that really we're debating for the future of this country. The paradigm of central planning, the paradigm of interventionism, perpetual crises, and a paradigm of free markets, our heritage, a paradigm that I would suggest is not only consistent with sound economic principles, but is also consistent with moral principles. Loving thy neighbor as thyself, do unto others, and that is consistent with natural harmonies that exist within human beings. Thank you.
You know, there's a big difference between the Berlin Wall and this barrier that the American government is finally, after all these years, getting around to build on the southern border, and that is the Berlin Wall was there to keep people in. But that wall, this wall on the southern border, is to keep them out. And it's a fundamental distinction, because it's up to the people in this country to decide, do they want this country to become Mexico or not? In that respect, immigration is not like free trade, because, you know, do people get to vote on who comes in? Most of the time they don't. If some employer wants to hire an illegal alien, the fact is, what time am I finishing? 8, right. The fact is that the community at large around him doesn't get to vote on that, but they do get to pay for it, because he's unloading a lot of the costs of that immigrant. The education costs, this is true for legal immigrants as well. The education costs, to a considerable extent, the health costs, which the local hospitals bear, because that's a really ingenious scheme the government's thought up. It doesn't pass through the government's books at all. They force the hospitals to treat these people. The hospitals dump the costs on insured Americans. That's why health insurance is going up so much. One major reason. It doesn't even have to pass through the government's books at all. I don't think that, if I may say so, that Bumper has really thought through the implications of what it means to have immigration, both legal and illegal, and the welfare state. He's just stuck back in the 1960s, before this problem arose. I don't recognize his description of the 65 Act. It did not favor skilled immigrants. It did exactly the opposite. It favored what they call family unification. If you get in here legally, you can bring all kinds of relatives in, and they can bring all kinds of relatives in. And there are many cases where single immigrants have ultimately resulted in 400 and 500 immigrants coming in from these various countries that they come in from. That's why the immigrant inflow, illegal immigrant inflow in this country, is so dominated by some odd countries like Jamaica and things like that, because they were able to sponsor their own relatives in so much. And the result of that is that skill levels have actually fallen for legal immigrants, to the point where legal immigrants overall are less skilled than the native born for the first time in American history. Talking of American history, there's no tradition of free immigration to this country. When immigration was in the hands of the states, as it was until about the 1870s, those states fought to prevent the arrival of what they regard as paupers, of people who, and the disease, another major problem. The second act passed by the Bay Colonies legislature was an act to prevent the arrival of paupers from England. They were very concerned about who came in. That's the true American tradition. You know, even in Ellis Island, with the flow that we hear so much about 2% of those people were sent back once they arrived because they might become a public charge or because they were worried about health. Now, with the flow, because they had some disease or other, with the flow of somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million gross illegals across the border every year, this country's never been more exposed to disease. And that's why you occasionally see outbreaks of things like tuberculosis and leprosy. The press won't say who's doing it, but they will say sometimes that health officials say they won't report immigration status. It's like reading Pravda. You've got to read between the lines as to what's going on here. Let me finish up by talking about Hayek. Friedrich von Hayek was the great classical liberal economist. Actually wrote somewhere that in his autobiography that he tried to settle, to buy property in a Swiss commune. He wanted to live in Switzerland, and the locals rejected him. They told him that they didn't want to have foreigners. That is to say, he taught in Switzerland for many years, though he was born in Austria. They didn't want to have him in their local community. And he didn't mind that. He thought they had a right to do it. So there's a conflict of rights here. Maybe some people have a right to immigrate, but maybe the community has a right to stop them. And that's what we should be thinking about. What are the rights that Americans have in regard to this unprecedented inflow? Do they have a right to determine the future of their society in which their children will live? Thank you.
Every day, countless people move from or travel across the border between Maryland and Virginia. We don't know how many there are. Nobody keeps count. I have never heard a one Virginian say, you know, those Marylanders that came in here, they're coming in here, they're stealing my job. I know they're stealing my job. They're trying to steal my job. We don't think in terms like that. And I'm willing to bet that most people in Illinois don't sit here in anguish over the fact that there's people coming in from Missouri or Indiana or Iowa and so forth. Everybody's just dealing with each other as a human being. In fact, we very rarely think in terms of citizenship when we're dealing on a daily basis. You go into Macy's and you say, I'd like a bottle of cologne, and the lady speaks with an accent. How many of us say, excuse me, but I would like to know whether you're a citizen before I buy this bottle of cologne? We have a habit of just dealing with people as human beings, and the only reason we think of citizenship is because of this central planning, interventionist crisis that makes us think in terms of people that are here in violation of the plan. In the absence of the plan, there are no illegals. It's all legal immigration. And so you very well may have in Illinois 10% Swiss citizens, 20% German citizens, 30% Mexican citizens, maybe none of whom are seeking to change their citizenship. Who cares? You might run into some woman that speaks with a French accent and you say, oh, well, where are you from? Oh, I'm Swiss. I'm here. I got a job as a consultant helping an American company work in Switzerland. Great. You don't think about it in terms of citizenship until you start thinking of this crisis that they've created for us, except on Election Day. That's when it would make a difference. Only citizens could vote. But otherwise, you treat people just as human beings. Now, let me address this welfare thing. This is one of the greatest canards. They're coming on welfare. They're coming to get on welfare. How logical is that? I have grown up with these people. I grew up on the South Texas border. They're the hardest working people you've ever seen. If they're going to risk their lives, spend $2,500 to get transport up here, leave their wife and children in the hopes that they're going to walk into a welfare office and convince somebody that they're an American citizen so that they can sit here and languish on some welfare check, it just doesn't happen. And in fact, legal immigrants are barred from welfare for 5 years. How logical is it that an illegal alien is coming here for that purpose? Now, obviously, some of the welfare institutions force them into this. Government schooling, another example of socialist central planning. A government-owned hospital. My associate Sheldon Richmond puts it this way: have you ever noticed that it's only the public sector that complains about too many customers? You know, but why should we, the advocates of liberty, because the central planners force people into their programs, why should they manipulate us into joining their ranks? Why shouldn't we stand fast for our principles and talk in terms of ending the socialism in public schooling or the socialism of government-owned healthcare institutions? That's the root of the problem. And if we abandon our principles because it happens to cost us a little bit more, then where are we left as advocates of liberty? I live in one of the fastest growing counties in the country. I don't have children. I'm having to fund the education of other people. And more people are flooding in, middle-class people, and they have these bond issues. But I will never, ever, because I'm having to pay these bond issues and taxes, ever say, no more people should be allowed into this county. Now, these two books I mentioned, they have study after study after study, Legrand's book and Riley's book, showing that overall immigrants are a tremendous plus economically. That when you factor in the taxes they pay, the economic prosperity they do, and these are studies that are conducted by government officials, not just the think tanks and the private institutions. An example of this whole process was the EU. All the dire predictions that Peter and his side made, they made with respect to the EU. That you couldn't have people crossing borders freely between Italy and France, for example, because the borders would disappear, they destroy the culture and all that stuff. Well, the EU people are the happiest people you've ever seen. You've got Italians going to France to learn French. They get a part-time job. Nobody's worried about their stealing a job from a French person. French are in Italy. There's that free flow of people. And guess what? Unemployment dropped in these countries after the borders were opened between the respective countries. Now, let me say a little bit about one more thing about the welfare. You know, I don't know if you all have kept up with this, but there's been a soaring in demand for one-way tickets between Poland and the United States. And why is that? Oh, one way toward Poland. And why is that? Because there's economic prosperity in Poland. Now, you would think that if they're here for welfare, they wouldn't be going back to where the jobs are. But that's what they're doing. Because that's what immigrants have historically done. They go to better their lives through labor. Now, let me say something about this culture business. You know, I've heard this argument for so many years that they're going to destroy our American culture. Well, I don't know what culture they're talking about. I grew up in Laredo, Texas. Let me tell you about what American culture is. You go into Laredo today, now this is America. Go into Laredo today and you do an informal survey of people eating in restaurants. I will guarantee you that 80% minimum of the conversations are in Spanish. You go into court where people are selected for jury duty, the judge will say, how many here cannot read or write the English language? 20% easily. Judge says you're excused. No one cares. It's not an issue. My dad could never speak a word of Spanish, and people treated him nicely, courteously. I didn't even know that speaking a foreign language in America was an issue until I went away to college up in Virginia. And then I discovered, my gosh, people think this is like something wrong. Nobody cares. And then, you know, and so if that's the culture he's talking about that we need to preserve, you guys got a lot to catching up to do here in Chicago. Because your culture isn't like that, and neither is the one in San Francisco or New Orleans or Savannah or New York City or Brunswick, Maine. Our culture is a culture of diversity, of that richness of diversity. We absorbed the entire northern half of Mexico, including its laws, its customs, its traditions, its language, its citizens. And we did fine. Because Americans were treating people as normal human beings. There wasn't such a thing as illegals. So that's what we're faced with. Finally, on this issue of disease, I've heard this canard so many times before. Though people might come in with disease. Well, you know what the next step is? Then we better stop Americans from traveling overseas. That'll be the next intervention, because I can guarantee you it's just as easy to catch an infectious disease overseas, traveling on those safaris to Africa, as it is to catch them from people coming in. These are all the canards that we've got to break through and restore this liberty that is not a luxury, Peter. Liberty is a necessity.
I have been in this debate for some time now. I know from experience that you simply cannot get it through immigration enthusiasts' head, that there's a ton of data out there derived from the federal government, which very clearly shows that immigrants are more involved in welfare than the native-born, particularly native-born whites. They just don't want to listen. None of this data is addressed by these two new books. And publishers like to publish pro-immigration books, never have any data in them. We've reviewed Lagrange's book and Riley's book. They're hopeless. There's no serious discussion of it. It's just rhetoric, which is frankly what we've been hearing tonight. But then, of course, Bumper can't help it. He's a trial lawyer. It's a terrible thing to say. But this is how he operates in front of a jury. I'm a financial journalist. I'm boring. I write about facts and data. And that's what we have here. Facts and data show that this is a foolish policy. By the way, while we're on this subject, it's also true that it's not at all the case that the European Union population is happy. That's why they keep voting down the Constitution, attempted by the bureaucrats to unify it more. In every major country in Europe now, there are serious anti-immigration parties underway. Two of them actually just won a major election in Austria. And that's because of this phenomenon of people coming into the country and the people who live there not being able to stop it. It will eventually break the European Union up. The idea that that game is over is simply wrong. Now, let's get this straight. How long do I have left this time?
You have 2.5.
Okay. As I say, fact and data aren't as interesting as emotion. So I'm going to do a bit of emoting myself. It's obvious when you listen to what Bumper says that is no conception of what an American is. I mean, he doesn't think in terms of national community and national identity. He generally doesn't distinguish between foreigners and who might be here illegally or legally. He doesn't seem to be clear about whether he's in favour of legal immigration or not with the current system. He just has no sense of what a national community actually is. In contrast, I very much prefer the attitude of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great novelist who died recently. He said in a Nobel Prize speech that every nation nations are the wealth of mankind. Each one of them represents a facet of the human personality and is an aspect of God's design. That's what I think is going on in the US. It represents a facet of the human personality, one with interest in liberty, an aspect of God's design. And I think it ought to be kept that way. If I have 1 minute left, I'm going to recommend to you a wonderful movie which is now available in DVD called The Singing Revolution. It's about Estonia and how it broke away from the Soviet Union. And the Estonians were faced with massive immigration from Russia, which to this day is a big problem for them. A third of the population is still Russian and wants to go back to the Soviet Union. They had a right to stop that, and they paid a very high price trying to resist it. I don't want to see that happen here. Thanks very much.
One of the interesting things about this debate so far is that I have not yet Peter come forward with what he considers would be the ideal plan, where we could finally end up not any longer having an immigration crisis. I mean, if such a plan exists, don't you think they would have come up with it by now, instead of just a series of ad hoc interventions and new laws and new interdictions that happen every 2 or 3 years? Now notice something else about this debate, and we're not finished because we still got time during the Q&A session. I hear he presented as a model the idea of open borders that exist here in the United States. People crossing from one state to another. I have challenged Peter by saying, this is an economic benefit, Peter. This is something good. Now, he might come back and say, well, they're all Americans. Fine, but the question is this something good that we're doing to each other, for each other? Or are we making a sacrifice by having the free flow of borders, free flow of people across state borders? In other words, if he's going to make the argument that immigration controls are economically beneficial for a nation, I would like to know where he stands with respect to immigration controls between the respective states. Does he believe that these are economically detrimental to the people of every state? Is this something that the framers made a mistake on? Is this a sacrifice that we're making, something bad we're doing to ourselves because we're Americans? See, I would argue that God has created a consistent universe, one in which economic laws are universally applied. And that if open borders is good for people crossing state lines where borders don't disappear and sovereignty doesn't disappear, the same principle would apply on international lines. Now, let me also raise the notion that there's a lot of Americans living overseas who don't assimilate. There's 1 million Americans living in Mexico. They don't learn Spanish. They hang out amongst themselves. They eat hot dogs and hamburgers instead of enchiladas and tacos. And they root for the Dallas Cowboys and other American sports teams. Fantastic. They retain their American citizenship. They remain loyal to the United States. Who cares? Why does it matter? You see, and the only reason it starts to matter to us, ladies and gentlemen, is because of this idea that there is an illegal sector that has violated the plan. Once you remove the plan, and you remove the interventions, and remove the crises, then it's no different with respect to people coming here touring, visiting, buying property, investing, opening up a business, than it is for Americans living in Paris, living in the Caribbean, living in Costa Rica, living in Mexico. These are the natural harmonies that exist within people that Frederick Bastiat talked about. And so I would argue that we're faced with a real choice in this country. One in which there is central planning, more socialism, more interventionism, and all the crises, or one that we can move and lead the world out of this socialist morass, not only in the housing industry, the healthcare industry, the educational industry, but also in the immigration area. Lead the world. We Americans, we advocates of liberty and free markets, lead the world out of this morass and onto the highest reaches of freedom that mankind has ever seen. Thank you very much.
Well, nicely done, gentlemen. I've got about 52 decks of cards here, I think, with questions. Peter, I ask you to stand at the other podium, please. And Bumper, you'll come up here if you would, please. One question has recurred on several cards, and it has to do with terrorism. Peter, to you, Bumper, to you, does not the threat of terrorism become more real with open borders?
When we're dealing with a weed, it's always important to pull the weed out by its root, or if we use a medical analogy, if we're going to talk about a disease or a sickness, it's important that we come up with the right diagnosis. Now, I'm a libertarian, and I have taken a very, very firm stance against U.S. foreign policy. I've absolutely, and in Future Freedom Foundation, we've taken a leading role in this since our inception, long before 9/11. That if you want to get rid of terrorism, you got to get rid of the anger and the rage against this country that is rooted in U.S. foreign policy. But that's not the topic of the debate tonight. Let's assume that everything stays status quo as far as the U.S. empire goes overseas, and there's a threat of terrorist blowback. How do you deal with that? Well, we had this problem between Maryland and Virginia. We had terrorists coming in from Maryland, and they were terrorizing people in Virginia. They were snipers. They were killing people in our state, and then they'd go back to Maryland. At no time did we ever shut the border down to keep the terrorists from coming into Virginia. We didn't spy on everybody. We didn't have the cops spy on everybody and control everybody. Instead, we used good police work with the support of the citizen, leads and so forth. We finally caught the guys. That's exactly what needs to be done with respect to terrorism. Here we are using scarce resources, monitoring the activity of millions of people crossing the border, 99% of whom are not terrorists, that are just trying to seek a better way of life. And so you defuse your resources. Better that you concentrate your resources on the people that you have the evidence, the probable cause or whatever, that are committing the crime, using leads, good police work, and you hone your resources onto those people instead of diffusing it over a wide range of people, most of whom are totally innocent of everything.
Peter?
I can see that bumper hasn't mentioned that John Malvo, the Washington sniper, was himself an immigrant doing a job, I guess, that Americans didn't want to do. You know, obviously the Bush administration's policy here is hopelessly contradictory. On the one hand, they were clearly determined to integrate the workforces of Mexico and the US. And that's why the Bush administration simply stopped enforcing the law. On the workplace enforcement of the Bush administration fell by a factor of 99%. But they had a contradiction on the border, because it is very easy to cross this border, and people who appear to be terrorists have done it. And we see that there's several cases of this which we report on vdare.com. What happens is the local officials will give local press conferences saying we've caught people who for one reason appear to be terrorists, usually because they come from the countries involved or they're carrying weapons or something. And then a few days later, Washington puts out a press release saying this was all a mistake and one thing and another, and the whole issue dies. Because the issue is hopeless contradiction. On the one hand, the Bush administration clearly likes illegal immigration. In fact, you know, Bush 1 actually, apparently, it was a tacit part of the NAFTA agreement that they were going to let illegal immigration increase because of the disruption of that NAFTA was imposing on the Mexican corn price supports. On the other hand, they have this problem with terrorists, so they have a contradiction about it. You know, and their policies hopelessly contradict. The idea of, you know, of letting vast numbers of Muslims into the country since 9/11 is madness on its face, and will ultimately come around to bite the Americans someplace inconvenient.
Peter, for you, would you restrict the immigration of highly skilled workers, many of whom have been educated here but then must leave, for example, doctors and so on?
You know, in Alienation and on vdare.com, we make a very broad case about immigration, and there's a lot of different aspects to it. One of the things I said in Alienation was that I actually objected to the current policy because it does actually keep skilled immigrants out. It's more difficult to get in as a skilled immigrant than it used to be, legally, into this country. People from the computer software businesses, programmers, came to me and pointed out that their businesses, their livelihoods have been completely broken down by the software companies importing very large numbers of so-called temporary workers on these H-1B visas. So I've somewhat had to rethink that. I mean, you know, in economics there are no absolute goods. There's only a certain number of skilled workers you really need in the economy. If you look at employment levels among American PhDs, you find that unemployment levels and so on are quite high in surprising areas. So the bumper complains I've not given you a policy. My policy, there should be moratorium. We should recognize that the immigration era is over just as the frontier closed over 100 years ago. We should have a moratorium when there's no net immigration at all. There's about 200,000 people gross leave this country every year. So if you had 200,000 people in a year, you have zero net. And that would take care of needed skills and hardship cases and so on. But I think we should have basically no net immigration for a long time until this current influx has been absorbed, and that ultimately goes for skilled immigrants. Like myself, skilled immigrants are a luxury. They can be beneficial to the country, but they do displace people. There's a reason why, if I wasn't here, an American would be writing my Market Watch column. And you have to recognise there is displacement there. Now, arguably, my Market Watch columns are better, and that more people making more money and so on, and that's a good thing. But you have to recognise that the writer who was displaced, he may not necessarily benefit from that. So the cost of immigration, of skilled immigration, they don't necessarily, they fall on the same people who benefit from it. So there is kind of an equity issue involved, which has to be resolved through the political process. I guess my bottom line is I regard skilled immigrants as a luxury, and right now I don't think we're in a position for much luxury in this policy. We have a necessity of getting the situation under control.
This is for Bumper. Should we not attempt to eliminate the family reunification from immigration policy in the United States?
I hope I made my position clear. I would eliminate all restrictions. All restrictions on the free flows of people. What we're talking about, it's easy for us to think in terms of domestically, where people are freely flowing across borders with no allocation from some central planner. Admittedly, it's difficult to take that thinking and apply it to the international arena, but that's what needs to be done. Now, notice how Peter answered that last question. This is the dilemma of the central planner. This is what Hayek called the fatal conceit, that the central planner obviously thinks he possesses the requisite knowledge and expertise to be able to decide who are the right kind of people, which physicians, which highly skilled people, what their qualifications are. It can't be done. That's why you have planned chaos, as Mises said. Why not just let the market make these determinations? Are doctors needed? Prices for doctors will rise. Are people needed in New Orleans? Nobody's allocating workers to New Orleans. You don't have a government agency doing that. The price of labor rises, and all of a sudden labor from Seattle and Maine and so forth starts heading toward New Orleans. It's the same principle with respect to the international arena.
Of course, that labor from Seattle is less likely to head towards New Orleans if it turns out that the jobs have already all been taken by Hispanic illegal immigrants, which is in fact the case. That's why the New Orleans is now heavily Hispanic. You're just not thinking about how this actually works in the real world. Ultimately, I also think that I'm not in favor of fine-tuned immigration policy as Bumper is. He wants to throw it wide open. I don't think that can work with a welfare state. I have a Friedman-type rule, as he proposed for monetary policy. It's zero. We should have net zero immigration. That's a simple rule. I don't see what the problem with that is. And finally, it occurs to me, I was thinking about all these Mexicans and these Americans in Mexico. They're in a very tenuous legal situation, by the way, because Mexicans don't allow immigration. Oddly enough, there's no reciprocity between these countries who are allowing an inflow, who have an inflow into the U.S. and whether Americans can go there. Typically, they won't allow Americans. It's very hard to immigrate to Mexico. But the point is that the Mexicans who are there, the Americans who are there, can't vote, and their children aren't automatically citizens. So they're not going to transform the society in the way that illegal immigrants here are transforming the society through the workings of the Citizen Child Clause of the 14th Amendment, which I presume you're in favor of abolishing. You don't think an illegal immigrant, when he's here, an American-born child should be a citizen. Is that right?
I will gladly grant you the right to set any requisites you want for citizenship if you in turn will accede to my request to open the borders to the free flow of people. Because it doesn't matter to me. It doesn't matter to me. If you can make citizenship as stringent as you want. Doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is the liberty of people to move into an area and interact with other people on a mutual voluntary basis, whether they remain foreign citizens or not. I have no interest in these Americans living in Mexico changing their citizenship to Mexican. Why should they?
Well, the answer to that, of course, is that if we were to move to do that, we would simply have a situation where we have a huge helot class, like the Spartans did, a class of people who can't vote. I mean, fundamentally, what Bumper is advocating is a deeply anti-democratic policy. He won't pay any attention to what the Americans want on immigration. It's very clear that Americans are opposed to immigration, would stop it if they could. The polls have been clear on that for many, many years. He just pays no attention to what they want, and he's prepared to allow people to live here and conduct their lives and have children and so on, who will never be citizens. So what an extraordinary bifurcated society that's going to be.
Last question, gentlemen, and try to be brief. It's going to be tough, though. It begins with you, Peter. What gives the government the right to stop an American property owner from selling or renting his property to anyone he chooses as long as public health is not threatened?
It's called the common law. There are reasons why why the government has. You see, I'm not a complete anarchist, and I think there is such a thing as a human community, and there is such a thing as a legitimate role for government.
See, and I totally agree with the questioner. I mean, either Jefferson was right or he wasn't. Either we subscribe to Jefferson's principles. We celebrate this 4th of July every year. Now, we're not celebrating just a military victory at Yorktown. We're celebrating the enunciation of the most radical doctrine of rights that has ever been enunciated. That is that all people, not just Americans, are endowed with fundamental rights, that among these are life, which means the right to sustain your life through labor, liberty, which includes economic liberty, liberty of contracts, entering into mutually beneficial transactions with others, private property, Jefferson didn't say that, but certainly John Locke did, the right to accumulate wealth, the right to pursue happiness.
But Jefferson didn't like immigration. Jefferson was critical of immigrants.
I'm talking about the enunciation of rights.
Well, I'm talking about Jefferson. He didn't like immigrants.
These rights pre-exist government. They exist. We haven't even talking about the moral moral arguments here, repatriating people into Cuban communist tyranny. I mean, I never thought that I'd see the day when this country would be doing such a thing. But that's why we need to be talking in terms, as that questioner says, in terms of the inherent rights of man, rights that I say trump socialist central plans and interventions.
I was looking at an older agenda. We have another 15 minutes, I beg your pardon. Bumper, your position rests on an absolute rejection of the concept of national sovereignty. The notion that national sovereignty is synonymous with central planning is a red herring. Can you name any country in the world whose citizens would accept unrestricted immigration into their country?
But I don't reject national sovereignty. That's the whole point here, is that the free flows of people, free trade, free immigration, does not interfere with sovereignty. I mean, that's the whole point I was trying to make with respect to people that come into Illinois from Iowa. Iowa doesn't lose sovereignty. It's the citizen who submits himself, or the traveler who submits himself to the law of the jurisdiction in which he finds himself. When those of you that travel overseas, when you go overseas, you have to comply with the laws of the country. We all know this. They have drug laws, you comply with those laws. In Virginia, we have a law that prohibits people from having radar detectors in their cars, if you can believe that one. Well, everybody that comes into Virginia has got to comply with that law. Okay? He can't say, I'm a Marylander, or I'm a Canadian, and we don't believe in these laws. We don't have them where I am. He has to submit to the law. So in other words, people that come into the United States, which means they're going to be coming into one of the 50 states, nobody loses sovereignty. There's no border that disappears. Somebody that comes into Texas, Texas retains full sovereignty over everybody that comes into that jurisdiction.
I guess this raises in my mind the question whether Bumper knows what national sovereignty is. I mean, you know, if people come into this country and they can vote, it's entirely possible, logically possible, that they can get control of the political process, and that's exactly what was happening in Estonia. And it is happening in large parts of this country right now. I mean, there are parts of this country where native-born Americans have left and have become Spanish-speaking and so on. I'm against it. I don't see why I should be in favor of it, or pretend that it's a good thing. As a matter of fact, there have been in many instances in American history where there have been friction between the states about people crossing the state lines and taking jobs. For example, during the Depression, it was a regular thing for people to be stopped coming into California because they were going to take jobs from Californians. But when you enter a federal union, you make compromises. And you trade the ability, that type of sovereignty, absolute sovereignty, for other things which you hope are going to benefit you. And that's a constant problem in keeping a federal union together, making sure that the peoples of the several states actually are benefiting from being in the federal union.
Peter, what do you think about attaching a property right to citizenship, allowing individuals to buy or sell their status of being a U.S. citizen?
We have a writer on VDA.com, Randall Burns, who thinks himself as being left-wing. He's a progressive, because it's a forum site. We have people from all political persuasions, as long as they're interested in the immigration issue in the right way, who's made this argument. And he's also argued that you actually can calculate what the value of a green card is. A green card is the legal residency permit, by looking at the Indian dowry market. The Indians apparently have a serious auction process for their dowries, and you can value an Indian who has a green card, is worth more than one who doesn't. And it's quite high. It's like $500,000. I would favour almost any system rather than the current system, which is completely broken, needs to be broken, torn apart, and started from scratch.
Yeah, well, let me just address this point about that people, because they live in a certain jurisdiction, have to have the right to vote. That's just fallacious. I mean, there's people that live in Paris, there's people that live in Russia that are American citizens, and they don't vote in those countries. They retain their citizenship here, they vote here. Suppose there's, here in Illinois, 10% Swiss, 20% German, 30% Mexican. They all vote back in their home countries. If they think that the right to vote is important, then go back home. But as long as it's voluntary, as long as Americans are living in Mexico and voting absentee in the United States, or people are living here and voting absentee in Switzerland, some of them are applying for American citizenship, others are not. As long as it's all free, I don't see what the problem is.
So you're in favour of abolishing the citizenship clause? You don't mind the clause which says that a child born here, even of illegal parents, is automatically an American citizen?
I like the clause because it protects the child. But what I'm saying is it's not critically important to me. What matters to me is liberty. And the fact that people are living here and that are not citizens, it's a non-issue for me. The only reason it's an issue for most people is because of this plan that separates out a certain number of people as illegals.
What kind of a free society is it when large portions of the population can't vote and can be pushed around by the portion of the population that can vote?
Well, no, that's where the protection of minority rights comes in. That's what the Bill of Rights is all about, to protect the minority, whether they vote or not. But as long as people find it satisfactory to live in a country, even though they can't vote in that country, why shouldn't that be left up to them?
What if the other people in the society don't want them there? I think they ought to go away.
They're free to discriminate against them, Peter. They're free not to associate with them. But what right
Not now, of course.
I'm sorry?
Not now, of course. They're not free now.
Well, no, but they should be.
In other words, you're against the Civil Rights Act and so on.
Absolutely. People have a right to discriminate. It's a moral right. Now, but what I'm asking you is, what right do you have to make it illegal for me to associate with people that I want to associate with that you don't happen to like?
It depends what kind of costs are involved, for one thing. I mean, for example, if those people that you like are coming here and they have children, those children have been educated at public expense, obviously I have a reason to object to that.
All right, let me ask you, if all public schooling were abolished and all public hospitals were privatized, would you then favor open borders?
Would pigs fly as well? Would pigs fly as well?
I'm sorry?
I said, would pigs fly as well?
Would
Pigs fly.
Pigs fly. Well, do you favor the abolition of public schooling and government-owned hospitals?
I've written a whole book about that, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. And immigration is happening every day, so we have to do something about it now.
This one comes from one of the legislators in the audience, so I ask you to interpret the question from that perspective. Bumper, No, I meant that in a positive way. Bumper, name one American community that has benefited from illegal immigration.
The entire country has benefited from immigration. I mean, this is the point. But if you want one, my hometown of Laredo, Texas. I mean, I grew up on a farm on the Rio Grande. We hired illegal aliens. They're the hardest working people you've ever met. I mean, you talk to anybody on the border. If you've never visited the border, it's a totally different culture what people are accustomed to. But what I'm saying is that if you look at these books that I mentioned, Legrand's book, Riley's book, what they're talking about is that immigrants are beneficial to a society. Now, he a minute ago suggested, I think, that immigration between the respective states is not a good thing, but that we have to have it because it's part of nationhood. Now, I may have misunderstood him, but I would like to know again that if immigration is not a positive benefit for communities everywhere, then why doesn't the same principle apply with respect to immigrants between the states or immigrants between counties?
When, in the Federalist Papers, of course, Jay addressed this question of a federal union. He said we can make a federal union work because we are one people, descended from the same fathers with one language and one religion. That's why he thought it could work. Now, what we're seeing now, of course, and by the way, he didn't mean Christianity, he meant Protestantism. The white population of the U.S. was overwhelmingly Protestant at that time. There was almost no Catholic immigration until the 1840s. Now, what we're seeing now, of course, is the introduction of diversity, and it really does raise the question of whether you can make a community work if people don't share common values. And that's the problem we face. I mean, there's a point at which, you know, Mexico will, if you bring enough Mexicans in, this will become Mexico or some other country. I believe Americans should be asked if they want that to happen, and they have the right to say no.
Let me ask you something, Peter. Let me ask you, do you believe that it was a mistake for the United States to take over the northern half of Mexico, which consisted of California, Arizona, New Mexico, and arguably Texas, even though Texas was, in its own mind, an independent nation at the time? Do you think that it was wrong to take over that foreign country?
I'm surprised to find as a libertarian that you imply it was a good thing, because it certainly was It certainly was an act of imperial aggression, but I come from an imperialist nation, so that doesn't bother me. What you don't seem to realize, Bumper, is that there were almost no Mexicans living in that area. We've done the calculations, and if the only Hispanics in the country were people who'd been living in the people who came into the country as a result of the treaty, you know, it'll be less than 1 million Hispanics. There were almost nobody in these areas. Their influence was nugatory. So it's a complete mistake to imagine they took over some kind of a thriving community and adapted to its mores. They didn't. They just ran over it and imposed Anglo-Saxon values on it, for good or ill.
You'd have a hard time convincing the people of San Antonio and Houston and...
Bumper, as you know perfectly well, most of those are recent immigrants. Those areas were English-speaking to within living memory, the border of Texas.
Excuse me, but even today, Peter, you go to Laredo and about 90% of the people there are Spanish surnamed. And the reason that they all speak Spanish, or 80–90% of them speak Spanish, is because it was once part of Mexico and Spain and the Indian part of America down there.
There were almost no Hispanics in this country until the 1960s. The Hispanic population that we see now is almost entirely a result of government policy of importing. About 40% of all Hispanics in this country are immigrants. So no, there are areas in South Texas which were English-speaking, which are now Spanish-speaking because of immigration.
Speaking of Texas and in the South, this is from a woman from Texas herself who is supportive of open immigration borders, but it concerns her when she hears that a small southern Texas town has chosen Spanish as its official language. The question then is, does that not create a barrier for assimilation? Does that not create a community within the United States that cannot, that is not only not part of the United States, but has no loyalty to the United States? Bumper?
Now, what she's referring to is a little small town south of Laredo that they decided to conduct their city council meetings in Spanish because that was the primary language. I mean, when I tell you that the culture on the border is very different from everywhere else, I'm not kidding. I know people in Laredo that were born and raised there, Americans. They cannot speak English. They just cannot do it. Now, we can sit here and say they should have, and they could have, and they had public schools and so forth. We're just talking about reality here, that people communicate. Now, that doesn't mean that they engage, that they're somehow unethical or lack integrity. They just communicate in a different way. Now, I agree. I have reservations about government institutions that are conducted in Spanish. I'm not sure I would have gone along with that. But you have to understand that down there on the border, things are just treated differently. In courts, you have official interpreters. I represented a client practicing law one time in a criminal case. He couldn't speak English, and I asked the judge, would you assign an interpreter to interpret every bit of the testimony in this case? And the federal judge says, sure, motion granted. I mean, everything's done more casually, and it's not a big issue and so forth. And so the rest of the country got really upset over this small little town. There's just a few hundred people there. But I can guarantee you that everybody in that town spoke Spanish. And it was just easier for them to communicate.
Who paid for the interpreter, by the way?
I'm sorry?
Who paid for the interpreter? I mean, obviously, to the extent that we continue to permit massive Spanish-speaking immigration, and half of all legal immigrants to this country are Mexicans, by the way. You know, obviously we're going to face the danger of a bilingual society developing. All the time we get email at vdare.com from people who tell us that they can't, the local businesses won't hire them because the Spanish speakers, they're monolingual Americans, and that they speak English. And at a certain point, these companies reach the point that so much of the workforce is Spanish that they insist on everybody being bilingual. And that means that the local people in these areas, these factories and so on, can't get work because they don't speak Spanish. Now, that is only happening because we've allowed the borders to collapse. It doesn't hurt anybody in this room, probably. But to a lot of working-class Americans, it's a very serious problem, and you know, we should look after them.
This is indeed the last question. And it isn't a question. You both have 1 minute for final summation. Peter, I start with you, and Bumper, you have the last word. Peter, 1 minute.
As I said earlier, you know, I'm interested in facts and data. The facts and data are very clear in this area. They have been for 15 years. This inflow is of no benefit to the native-born Americans. It should be stopped. The ultimate question is, you know, what kind of world are our children going to live in? The answer is that, you know, I fear for it. I think that ultimately this inflow is going to reduce many English-speaking people to this country as second-class citizens. I think it will ultimately break up the federal union. It couldn't be a worse outlook, and it should be an election issue, and it's a disgrace that it isn't.
Well, let me first thank you again for inviting me to participate in this. You know, Peter and I have been trying to get together for about, I don't know, 10 years, Peter, or so, to debate. We first proposed a debate between ourselves about 10 years ago, and things have come up. We've never been able to do it, and I thank the Heartland Institute for finally bringing us together, Peter. You know, the entire world is mired in crises, in poverty, tyranny, socialism. This is the era of socialism in which we've been born and raised. We have socialist central planning in education, public schooling, health care, Medicare, Medicaid, the dollar, which is nothing more than monetary central planning by the Federal Reserve, the mortgage industry. We have intervention after intervention after intervention, the drug war, and then again, the case I'm making today is that this same syndrome exists in immigration. The world is crying out for leadership. We can remain mired in this socialism. We can sit here and debate and discuss and trying to come up with the perfect reform of it all, but we will never succeed because it's inherently defective. That paradigm should be thrown into the dustbin of history. I say it's up for us Americans, those of us living today, before we pass from this earth, to leave a legacy that was started in 1787, and we build on that legacy, and we lead the world out of this morass and onto freedom and free markets. Thank you.
Peter Brimelow, Bumper Hornberger. Thank you, gentlemen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage Heartland's President Joseph Bass to present the Heartland Liberty Prizes.
All right, wake up. Wasn't that fantastic? Just incredible. I asked the audience in my opening remarks to feel free to comment and participate as a live audience in the debate. You didn't disappoint me. Thank you very much for livening it up with your comments and your shouts from the back of the room. I think that was entirely appropriate. I'd like a quick show of hands for who you think won this debate. Now, it was a very clear choice, obviously. Bumper Hornberger is for open borders, over and over again, completely open borders. And Peter was in favor of a moratorium on immigration. We're going to do this by a show of hands rather than by volume of voice for obvious reasons. So those of you who are in favor of open borders, please raise your hands. Those of you who are in favor of a moratorium on immigration, raise your hands. Wow. From my vantage point, I'd give a small edge to the open borders guys, but I think we'd need a formal count in order to really confirm that. Now, how about if only people who live in Illinois vote, since you guys are all immigrants to this state? We won't do that. But tell you what, we will do one more vote, if you don't mind. Who's in favor of the bailout that the Senate is going to be voting on tomorrow? All those in favor, please raise your hand. 8 of you. How many are opposed to the bailout? All right. 501 of you. All right. I think we can resolve that. It is now my pleasure. It's now my pleasure to announce the Heartland Liberty Prizes for 2008. This prize is given to people who have made extraordinary contributions to individual freedom over the last year and over their careers. Past recipients of this award have included Gary Becker, Ed Crane, Richard Epstein, Father Robert Sirico, John Stossel, and Walter Williams. We don't give this award away lightly. It's reserved for those who have made major contributions to the advancement of individual freedom. Dennis Avery is director of the Center for Global Food Issues and a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He's the author of several books, including Saving the Planet with Pesticides and Plastic, which gets the award for best title, if not best book. Throughout his career, Dennis has been absolutely fearless in advancing very unpopular free market positions. For example, that pesticides and fertilizer and genetic engineering are responsible for saving billions of people from starvation, that those who oppose modern technology in agriculture are actually opposed to the survival of billions of people around the world, and that the cost of attempting to stop global warming far exceed any of the potential benefits. Fred Singer is an atmospheric and space physicist who is one of the world's most respected and widely published experts on climate. He's a distinguished research professor at George Mason University and a professor emeritus of environmental science at the University of Virginia. He directs the nonprofit Science and Environmental Policy Project, which he founded in 1990 and incorporated in 1992 after he retired from the University of Virginia. He has held positions with the U.S. Department of Transportation, the National Advisory Committee on Oceans and the Atmosphere, the EPA, the U.S. Department of Interior, and he was the first director of the National Weather Satellite Service. He's published over 200 articles in peer-reviewed journals. He's written or edited over a dozen books. In 2006, Singer and Avery co-authored a remarkable book, Unstoppable Global Warming, Every 1,500 Years. It ended up on the New York Times bestsellers list. It was a direct challenge to the orthodoxy on climate change. It sparked a national and then an international debate. Late last year, I had the privilege of working with Dr. Singer and Mr. Avery to do a new edition of that book, cleaned it up a little bit, and we have since distributed 130,000 copies of this book across the country, and a Spanish edition is going to go to the printer in about maybe 3-4 weeks. Friends, or 3 or 4 months, maybe. Friends of Liberty and Sound Science have drawn a lot of inspiration from Dennis and from Fred. They are absolute folk heroes in the skeptics community on global warming in recognition for their tremendous contribution to one of the most important public policy issues of our age. Please welcome or join me in congratulating Fred Singer and Dennis Avery.
Thank you, Joe. I think it goes without saying that a great deal of the impact of the book is due to the distribution to public policy leaders in this country that Joe just mentioned. But it is a pretty good book. And this all started about 3 years ago when my boss called me and said, the board thinks that Hudson should have a book on global warming. Does the world need another book on global warming? And I'd been reading on the issue, and I said, yeah, we need a book on the physical evidence of the Earth's past warmings. But I'm an economist. Why would I write that book? He said, get yourself a co-author. And I called Fred Singer the best guy I could think of. But the book, writing that book at that time, that was my contribution. The science is Fred's, but the idea was mine. Now, the only other thing I want to say, we dedicated the book to all of the researchers who had flown in airplanes, climbed glaciers, swum the coral reefs to get that physical evidence, and it was right for us to make that dedication. But it meant that I couldn't, in the dedication, really thank the other person who was responsible for it, my wife Ann, who has been my editor and my personal life support system through 3 books, dozens of reports, hundreds of articles. I don't know if she'll stand up, but I hope she will. Because finally, this is an audience that will actually care. I thank the Heartland Institute, I thank Joe, I thank Fred. Boy, do I thank Fred. And I thank you.
I really appreciate the award. I want to thank the Heartland Institute. I have a confession to make. When Dennis first asked me to join his project of writing this book, I had no idea that it would become a bestseller. I thought we might sell the usual 2,000 copies to libraries. I was off by a factor of 100. That shows you something about estimation. It became successful, I think, partly because of the title that Dennis decided on. He said, let's call it Unstoppable Global Warming. And I said, what? And he said, yes, unstoppable global warming every 1,500 years. And I realized that this title would appeal to all of the supporters of Al Gore, because unstoppable global warming is what he's been preaching. But those who really know the score would know that the every 1,500 years means that the climate is controlled by natural cycles and not by humans. So it appealed to a lot of people. But what really made it successful, in my view, is that what you have here is something called the updated and expanded edition. And that is the work of Joe Bast, who personally devoted time and energy and a lot of genius to reorganizing the original book and putting it in a shape where people could read it and enjoy it. And for this, I'm very grateful to him. And again, I'm grateful to the Heartland Institute for the award. Thank you.
All right, the Heartland Liberty Prize this year consists of the eagles that are on the table here. I think you may have seen them in the registration area when you came in. They weigh like 50 pounds each, so we're not going to be able to hand them to Dr. Singer. But after this is over, in about 3 minutes, we'll have the camera guy up here. We'll shake hands and take pictures in front of it. And I hope that you all come up here and have a chance to shake hands with these guys, because I think you'll discover that they are just amazing people. Some of the smartest, kindest, most thoughtful, and most devoted people that I've had the chance to work with in 24 years. In a couple of minutes, we're going to start playing the vice presidential debate. It's going to be on that screen. Yeah. Food, I guess I see the desserts are along the wall on the left. Can somebody correct me if I'm wrong? On both sides. Okay, so there's food on both sides. Nikki, the liquor, where is that? Oh, okay, I see a bar. There we go. Okay, we got bars on my right. All four corners of this room. It's going to be a great night, I'm sure. Let's see, the gift basket. All right, the fat and carbohydrates and carcinogens and alcohol. And the lucky winner is Chris Johnston. It was fixed. Chris Johnston, the guy with the ponytail over there, is the son of Jim Johnston. Jim Johnston is one of the founding members of the Heartland Institute's board of directors. Congratulations, Chris. The mums on the stage here are available for free to a good home. I guess they get thrown away after this event unless you take them, so if you'd like a mum, please take a mum. Please give another round of applause for Peter Brimelow and Bumper Hornberger for their great job. I was just really thrilled with it. We're going to transcribe it, edit it, and publish it. And I think it's going to be an original contribution to the debate. Really just wonderful stuff. Please also recognize the Heartland Institute staff that made this event possible. Yeah, please stand up, Heartland staff, if you could. There we go, Brian, John. Yeah, they did a terrific job. Those of you who bought tickets or reserved tables know that I didn't spend a whole lot of time asking you to buy a table or buy a ticket this year. That was all Heartland staff. Lauren Chrysos and John O'Hara did a fantastic job on selling tables this year, so thank them. And finally, thank you for joining us tonight. This event is only successful if we can get people in the room. I know you're very busy. There was a lot of competing things going on, from baseball to politics this evening, but you showed up anyway. I greatly appreciate that. If you're not already a donor, become a donor. Doesn't cost a whole lot. We depend entirely on contributions, individual contributions to support our budget. If you're already a contributor, I hope you'll bump it up a little bit because we are doing God's work on this issue. I hope to see all of you next year. Please bring a friend so that we can, instead of having 500 people, maybe have 700 people next year and really pack this room wall to wall. Okay? Have a great evening and enjoy the debate. Oh, yeah. And the tobacco is up front. Remember that if you want tobacco.